we're back here. I didn't want to be back here, but we are back here. We have to talk about the most popular Twitch streamer who talks about politics, once again saying things about the war in Ukraine that is not true. Now, I do not want to pick on Hasan in particular to say that Hasan is the worst of all the Twitch political streamers or anything like that. I am talking about Hasan because he has so much influence and he has continuously gotten this wrong in the same manner for years now, despite the information being available to him if he was to go look at it. And despite the fact that he could have had a lot of time now to go speak with Ukrainians who live in Ukraine, go speak to Ukrainians that are displaced, go speak to anybody who's experiencing the direct effects of the war. He's willing to do that when it comes to Cubans. He's willing to do that when it comes to people from Yemen. He's willing to do that when it comes to people who are affected by other instances of imperial aggression around the world. But he has been unwilling to do that when it comes to the Ukrainians, despite him getting it so wrong at the start of the war, him dismissing the idea of invasion so totally and so completely. It actually got to the point where it bordered on parody. And when I say bordered on parody, I mean he was titling his streams like day 6 of Ukraine not getting invaded. He was recording videos on his phones, YouTube shorts, to announce his stream, where he was flipping his hair back and like, you know, it's another day of, you know, Ukraine not getting invaded. Oh my gosh, ha ha ha. This is the way he operated. And I'm not going to say that people don't get things wrong. People get things wrong, and he got it wrong. But he could have repositioned himself since then to learn why he got it wrong. Why that John Mearsheimer view of the war, that the Russians would never do such a thing, but if they did, it would be over so quickly, was not true. You don't come to these conclusions from nowhere. If a computer, and our brain is a computer, if our computer makes a calculation and gets it wrong, you would not just say, okay, I guess I got it wrong, and you move on. You would say, if a calculator says 1 + 1 = 3, something's wrong with the calculator. Before you keep using the calculator, before you keep talking about Ukraine, you go into the calculator, you fiddle around, you move this, you move that, you change some components, and you figure out what's like, hey, let's fix it. Instead, it seemed that he mostly either faded away from the topic, or when he came by, he would drive by the topic. He did not sit down and have conversations with people affected by the war. He did not reorientate his position to be acknowledging of the fact that the Russians wanted the war, they started the war, and they have continued to pursue the war, avoiding any ceasefire. He has instead rested his beliefs back from the time he was hosting the show with Ethan Klein, when he had his Ethan Klein podcast. I'm sorry, that's not what it was called, but I can't remember what it was called. I don't want to call it the Ethan Klein podcast, but the Ethan Klein podcast, or when he made previous comments before then or after about Boris Johnson and this secret deal that could have ended the war. And by using this, he removes America's responsibility to do anything, and essentially his responsibility to advocate for a policy that could bring the war to a faster end, whether that be providing them the munitions to take out the factories that produce drones or produce the munitions that carry out the war, whether it be bringing any pressure on the Russians to bring the war to a halt. If the Russians want the war, you have to make them not want the war for the war to end. And this has not been something that I think he has confronted. I don't think he knows how to have that conversation, simply because he has not even began to tiptoe in that way. And so he is still in the same place that he was when he was on the Ethan Klein show and immediately after the 2022 invasion. And I say all that because this came in my feed today, where Hasan essentially said I was wrong about the invasion happening, but everything else I was essentially correct about.
Like, yes, my initial prediction that Vladimir Putin would never invade Ukraine was wrong. It's a wrong prediction. The analysis was still obviously correct. So much so that, look at the situation now.
We stop throwing this adjective does not need to be added. Obviously correct. What do you mean obviously correct? You barely look at the war. What do you mean obviously correct? Just very obviously correct. Just literally like this type of look, you can give your opinion, okay? Part of the reason I don't like when Hasan talks about the war is because he talks about it And he's not just wrong, but he's wrong confidently. He was confidently wrong about them invading up until the point they invaded. And now he's confidently wrong about the rest of his analysis up until the point that will become undeniable or like impossible to ignore. And so far, it has not gotten to that stage, at least when it comes to his view, his vision. Obviously correct. Why?
So much so that, look at the situation now. Every single thing that I said, including the initial ceasefire agreement when Ukraine had the maximum leverage, should have been taken. The off-ramp, the Minsk agreements should have been taken.
And these silly Ukrainians, they looked the gift horse in the mouth and they rejected it. They had a deal where they had much more leverage, and it was a much better deal. I'm sorry, we'll let this go for a little bit, but this is a man who has not learned anything about the war in the last 4 years. It's like it's March of 2022. It's like it's March of 2022. There have been books published about what he's discussing. I mean, our enemies will vanish. You can go read it. It talks in details, in explicit detail about these potential off-ramps, which were offered as take it or leave it ultimatums to the Ukrainians, where the sticking point had to do with their disarmament. We'll get to that in a second, but he just says it so confidently as if, oh, God, I was right. If they simply would have listened to people like me and were not misguided by those silly Westerners. Oh, that Boris Johnson, that frizzy-haired freak, he ruined the possibility of peace. If they had just listened to the American socialists, then certainly this war wouldn't have been. This is naive. This is naive. We'll talk about it in more detail, but it's not just naive. It's also deeply ignorant.
These are no longer controversial opinions. At the time, people...
What do you mean they're no longer controversial opinions? These are not opinions that anyone who knows anything about Ukraine has. Why does he say it's not a controversial opinion for us to say, oh my gosh, Ukraine should have taken that deal? You want to know why nobody who follows the war says that? Because people remember that the deal that was on the table, I'm sorry, I said we get to it, but it's just so ignorant. The deal that was on the table was Ukraine disarms itself. Ukraine disarms itself, and then the war will end. Ukraine would limit itself to the amount of infantry it could have, the amount of tanks it could have, the amount of artillery it could have. This offer was made when? The offer was made after the Russians failed to take Kiev. They're failing to take Kiev, and then they asked the Ukrainians to disarm themselves, to disarm the force, and just stop them from taking Kiev. At the same time, the massacres around Bucha were being uncovered. Corpses and atrocities and torture. And so Ukrainians were thinking about, man, all these people in occupied territory being treated like this. This is how the Russians are behaving. We can't trust them. Oh, the Russians are demanding we get rid of the army that stopped them from taking the terror that was in Bucha into everyone's backyard. And it was at that moment that negotiations failed. They said that Ukraine had to cut its army in half. Not the army we see now of 750,000, 800,000 men. I'm talking about an army of 300,000. Cutting that in half to about 100,000 to 150,000, having no tank corps to speak of, having no air force to speak of, having no artillery corps to speak of, putting it so that if the Russians invaded again or wanted to use the immense military leverage they had, the Ukrainians would have no choice but to capitulate or essentially have to make the entire nation into a militia if the Russians chose to invade again within a week, because they would have no army to stop them. They would simply be spread out too thin. And this is treated as if, obviously, it's accepted consensus now. Everyone knows. Who is he talking to? Accepted consensus where? It's not accepted consensus anywhere in Ukraine. It's not accepted consensus in the East. It's not accepted consensus in Dnipro or Cherkasy. It's not accepted consensus in Lviv. It's not accepted consensus in Kiev and Kharkiv or Sumy or anywhere. It's not accepted consensus in Europe. It's not accepted consensus in NATO. It's not accepted consensus in the United States. It's not accepted consensus in any think tank that analyzes the war. It's not accepted consensus amongst the civilians. It's accepted consensus in his head. What does he mean? What consensus? It was really controversial at the time. Nobody talks about the peace deal as an actual offering of an off-ramp that could have seen the war cease where it was. It was an offering for Ukraine to disable itself so they wouldn't be able to stop the Russians if they did it again. The Ukrainians were viewing the Russian invasion through a 12-period of a 12-year period of aggression, where the Russians took Crimea, where the Russians go into Donetsk, where the Russians go into Luhansk, where the Russians engage in assassinations and sabotage and try to foster corruption within the Ukrainian state. And within that 12 years of aggression, they then invade, fail to achieve their objectives. And after failing to achieve their objectives, you say, fine, we'll go back to our previous positions, not liberate any occupied Ukrainian territory. We'll go back to our previous positions if you get rid of the guns that just took out that entire Russian army that was marching towards Kiev and made them go home packing. It is a ridiculous position. If this is really Hasan's moral framework, why was his response to us bombing the Iranians not Iran should disarm itself? Or that when Israel bombs Palestinians, the Palestinians must first and foremost disarm themselves? Why isn't that not his position when it comes to the Chinese? If they really want to have a good relationship with the United States, they should simply get rid of all the military installations in the South China Sea, because that is very simplistic analysis. It's very simplistic analysis, it's reductive analysis, and it's ignoring what was actually offered. In his mind, the Boris Johnson peace deal was, okay, we'll stop it where it is. This war sucks. Let's all go home. That was not the deal. The deal was take it or leave it, get rid of your army, or the war continues. The Ukrainians said no, and so the war continued. Negotiations ended after the Bucha massacre. That means that was quite a lot of time for them to talk. So it wasn't that Boris Johnson came in and his presence ended negotiations. They negotiated for like a month. A month is plenty of time for you to figure out if you didn't want to engage in this crime or not. The idea that the Ukrainians were looking at peace, a peace dove flew by them, and they simply like threw rocks at it until it went away, saying, Boris Johnson told us to do this. Get away from us, British people. Russian people. Sorry, Freudian slip. The British and the Russians. I've revealed the great conspiracy. I've revealed the true conspiracy. It's just, all he has to do is read an updated article. All he has to do is read something that wasn't published 4 years ago. The negotiations since then have been widely covered by both journalists in Ukraine, frontline and otherwise, journalists outside of Ukraine, that the negotiations were foiled. If you want the website to go to, Kiev Independent, go to that website, okay? It's not oligarch controlled. Go to that website, look up an article. If you don't trust the Kiev Independent, go somewhere else. Just look it up. Why did the peace deal fail? The peace deal failed because the Russians wanted Ukraine to disarm itself at the same time Ukraine was uncovering graves and trying to tell the Ukrainian public, disarm yourself, as they dig out their brother or their son or their grandmother from a grave. It's just not going to work. It's just not going to work. And so framing it in this way, oh, they should have taken it when they had much more leverage. They didn't have much more leverage. I don't want to clog up the airways here, so we'll pause for now and just continue.
Haboob_Pycom has donated $10. Ukraine's defensive war is NATO fascism. I am a very sophisticated thinker.
Very, very sophisticated. You know what? You don't trust Kiev Independent, even though I like them. Here's the New York Times, drafted as of 4/15/2022. Here is the leaked stuff. You can look at it. You can look. It's all public. It's all public information. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know what I'm supposed to present. I don't know what I'm supposed to give. This is why I'm so judgmental of the fact that he doesn't talk to Ukrainians. He doesn't need to talk to me. Okay, he could if he wanted to. He doesn't want to. He just needs to talk to somebody from the country who can update him about what's happened in the last 4 years. I mean, this negotiation, this was a month after the war started. He's had 4 years to learn. You should know better. You should know better than to repeat this nonsense.
Should have been taken. The off-ramp of the Minsk agreements should have been taken. These are no longer controversial opinions. At the time, people said, oh, you're fucking Vladimir Putin defender. Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you.
He's saying these are uncontroversial opinions. These are not even opinions. The Minsk Accords, people talk about that like, oh, that was a potential off-ramp. That failed for a caveat of reasons. I don't even want to get into that right now. We could in the future, but the Minsk Accords were violated by the Russians as well. Like the Minsk Accords said no Russian soldiers in Ukraine. And so the Ukrainians would say, okay, as part of the Minsk Accords, the Russian soldiers have to leave. The Russians would simply then say, there are no Russian soldiers in Ukraine, so we cannot withdraw Russian soldiers from Ukraine. It's like, I'm not, what am I doing? My hand's not in your face. My hand's not in your face. I can't pull it back because my hand's not in your face. If That's what you're dealing with here, saying like that just should have been accepted, assumes that accepting the Minsk Accords and Ukraine doing everything that the Minsk Accords demanded would have put an end to it. It always assumes that all we needed to do was placate the Russians just that much more. If we simply would have made an agreement for Ukraine to be more autonomous in the regional areas so that they could choose to be closer to Russia, if we just would have given up Crimea, or if we just would have given up the Donbass, or we just would have given up this or that or this or that, before knowing, of course, that the Russians would come around for more, like they did after Crimea, like they did after they took Donetsk and Luhansk and kicked hundreds of thousands of people out of their homes, fled. And this assumes that at any one of these points, all you had to do was give the Russians that little bit more and everything could have been avoided. It ignores Putin's foundational ideology. And he says Ukraine can either exist as a part of Russia or not at all. What does he mean? He wrote that months before he invaded Ukraine, like 4 or 5 months. I read it on the channel. We discussed it at the time. Like, it's not like Putin is like a chess piece on the international relations board and he doesn't believe anything. Those long Reddit speeches about history do mean something to him. They're deluded, they're demented, but just because sometimes we can be surprised by by how demented somebody is, does not mean we ignore it or pretend it isn't the case.
Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. Right? Now, that's the universal position. Hindsight 2020.
What is he talking about? It's the universal position. Is he just trying to manifest this? Does he think if he just says everybody agrees with me, don't ask questions over and over again, everyone's just going to accept? Oh, I guess everyone accepts that the Minsk Accord, the Minsk Accord was the one way to peace. And if we just would have listened more and obeyed the Minsk Accords more and allowed the Russians to have Russian troops in Ukraine against what the Minsk Accord even said, if we just would have made Ukraine disarm itself, then the Russians then would not have taken advantage of the fact that Ukraine disarmed itself after what? We're talking about 16 years of war now, 12, 13 years of war at the time. It's incredibly naive. It's almost a stereotypical opinion somebody would place on the left. This is like an SNL style lefty position on Russia. If you just give them a little bit more, I'm sure then the good-natured Russian will sprout out. Not gonna happen. It didn't happen. It wasn't on the table. In Minsk, it wasn't on the table. In 2022, Ukrainian disarmament is not something that leads to peace. It is something that kicks the can down the road to another generation of Ukrainians. Instead of it being the invasion of 2022, it simply would have been the invasion of 2023 or 2024 after they disarmed themselves.
It's not even hindsight. It was foresight at the time, it turns out. Things that people consider hindsight was fucking foresight. How many motherfuckers yelled at me and said, I'm pro Vladimir Putin. You're way too supportive of a shitty peace deal. Yeah, things got a lot better. Things got a lot better since then.
Yes. Yes. Yes, they did. That's the crazy thing is they did. The deal that was offered back in 2022 was that Ukraine gets an army of 150,000 men. You want to know what the recent negotiated offer was between the Trump administration and the Russians? The Russians acknowledge that Ukraine now is an armed state. It is a state that can, to some degree, defend itself despite the fact that they grind on forward. And so they've had to negotiate deals that sees the post-war Ukrainian army being an army of 800,000. Now, do you think Ukraine has more leverage dealing with somebody like the Russians?
Black-pilled Kiwi has donated $5. Hasan really gives the game away by not going into the specifics of Ukraine negotiations. Because if he did, he'd end up showing his audience easy reasons to disagree with.
Well, yeah, but he drives by the issue. And if you're driving by the issue, everything's way too blurry to see the nuance. So, of course. But yes, the deal has improved. Over 4 years ago, the deal that was being offered is that Ukraine has to cut its army in half. Now, the post-war Ukrainian army would be like 3 to 4 times bigger than the pre-war Ukrainian army, something that could really defend the state. They've approached full-scale war like it's a full-scale war for their existence, because for the Ukrainians, it is an existential war for their existence. So yes, Ukraine does have more leverage now. Ukraine the same day he said this, Ukraine had knocked out 40% of Russia's oil export capacity. That is the biggest energy disaster for the modern Russian state since the Second World War. That is more damage being done to Russian export ports. That is more damage being done to Russian oil refineries, more damage being done to the entirety of the Russian energy machine financing the war within the last year than has been done since World War II. Within the last 4 days. Within the last 4 days. I mean, it's not something that came easily. The Ukrainians had to expand their drone production. The Ukrainians had to start a long-range missile program with the Flamingo, the first of its kind in modern Ukrainian history. The Ukrainians had to convince the Brits to give them the Storm Shadow missile. The Ukrainians had to stretch out Russia's air defense systems to not just cover Ukraine, but cover over Russia, which, you know, despite the shrieking of many Western commentators of what it would mean to bring the war back to Russia, the Russians were not able to escalate past that point because right now, they don't have much more to escalate with. If they were to do mass scale conscription, that's one of the few things that might actually undermine Russian public sentiment towards the war. The one time you can see pro-Kremlin polling turn the Russian public against the Russian government, it is when the Russian government started taking those who had been conscripted and going and getting more of them in order to take the volunteers and those who had signed up to go to the Russian army and sending them on a one-way ticket to Ukraine. So, it's not like the Ukrainians haven't taken out a lot of Russians since then. It's not like the Ukrainians haven't expanded their drone production on the planet. So to say that the Ukrainians now have less leverage than they did back in 2022, does he just view leverage as territory? What is his version of leverage? If the Russians have had to adjust their position to acknowledge that Ukraine will exist as a powerful state with an army, with a modern drone force, with long-range missiles. Like, do you think the Russians back in 2022, if the Ukrainians had the Flamingo program going, do you think they would have said, you can keep that? Or do you think one of their demands would be, you can have no long-range missile program? That was one of the things the Russians started demanding. No Ukrainian drones, no Ukrainian missiles. None of that's being asked. None of that's being asked about limiting the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. All of that has fallen to the wayside, and Russia is now concentrating on territorial demands because that's something they can inch forward on at a high cost. So yes, I will say, despite the fact that Hasan Piker seems to think it is universally accepted consensus that the Ukrainians are in a worse position now, negotiating wise, and that, they should have accepted the deal back in 2022, universally accepted consensus, I have not heard one person, literally one living, breathing human being, say that to me in Ukraine. And I know people who have been displaced from their homes once, twice, thrice over. None of them have ever told me, oh my God, if only the government would have accepted the deal to disarm itself back in 2022. Nobody's ever said that to me because it's not universally accepted consensus. It's not a consensus of any sort. It's not a consensus of any kind. It's something that Hasan believes. I don't know why he believes it, but it's something that he believes.
Well, yeah, things got a lot better. Things got a lot better since then, right? That shitty peace deal would have been a massive W in comparison to the battle lines currently. I hear this all the time. Russia can't withstand the war. Their economy's crashing and Ukraine takes out the Russian infrastructure. Oh my fucking God. Oh my God. Oh my God. I can't believe that there's this, still to this fucking day. Ukraine is winning. Study up. Yeah, I saw they pushed back on some Russian positions.
So he can look at the active Russian front line, Ukrainian front line. He can go look at that. He can go see that there's counteroffensives happening locally in Zaporizhia, but he can't go and just Google what the deal was that he has made the center point of his entire Ukraine policy since then. Every single time the war comes up, he mentions the Boris Johnson deal and that it should have been accepted and Ukraine would have been much better if it just disarmed itself. This is something that he has made a center point of his defense of his position for years now. He has the power to go look up recent Ukrainian counteroffensives, but he doesn't have the power to just double check things he's been saying for years now that people have been saying in his periphery, whether he pays attention or not, is not true. And why does he react in such ridiculous? Oh my God, I can't believe somebody's bringing up problems that the Russian government, oh my God, the long range, how I can't believe I'm still hearing this at this point. My God, Does he think anyone bringing up Russia's problems with conducting the war is like a NATO bot? Like, the United States says this is going to be a quick war with Iran. The more it drags on, the more it's clear that their original projections for the war might not exactly be going the way it went. You know, it's not going the way they wanted, right? They might, you know, it might end up at the same station, but we're not taking that route. How can we, going on 5 years now, still be of the position, what? It's ridiculous to bring up long-range strike capacity. What? It's ridiculous to bring up the damage to infrastructure. What? It's ridiculous. Oh my God, it's so ridiculous that it doesn't even warrant a response. There is no good commentary to be had on this platform when it comes to the war in Ukraine. You're not going to get it from Hasan. You're certainly not going to get it from Asmongold. You're not going to get it from this platform, okay? If you need to get Ukraine commentary, my advice would be to go to find somebody on YouTube when there's many more accounts that are going to give you day-to-day updates or might know some basics about how the negotiations took place, or go read like Ukrainian publications, or go listen to people who've been studying it their whole life. I mean, look, I understand that like Hasan is entertaining. Hasan entertains somebody, I presume. Hasan is, you know, personable, I presume, to somebody.
A curd is a curd.
But come on. Like this isn't even trying. This isn't even trying. What am I supposed to do with this? Thank you for the $5. I appreciate it.
Got like, you know, a little bit of territory back. Fun fact, Quincy Institute is still smeared as a pro-Russia by some in D.C. for criticizing Biden's refusal to engage diplomatically with Russia to end this war. It turns out pushing diplomacy while correctly predicting the downsides of interventionist policy hurts your credibility in D.C. Good stuff. Quincy Institute experts in March 2022, it's highly unlikely that a protracted war will bring Ukraine significantly better terms. Both sides are going to have to accept painful compromises, all of which will become even more difficult to achieve if the conflict is allowed to continue. Ukraine was able to actually catch Russia by surprise. Russia greatly underestimated Ukrainian defenses, and Ukraine was able to successfully purge the Russian forces from Kiev, okay, where they withdrew back to the eastern flank. That was the highest leverage that Ukraine had. Since that moment, Ukraine has lost leverage over and over again, piece by piece, every single day.
What leverage is he discussing? What he just says leverage like it's an act, like there is a leverage meter and the meter goes up or the meter goes down, right? There are many things that give leverage. Your manpower and your capacity to continue to conduct the war gives you leverage. Your will to fight gives you leverage. Your munitions gives you leverage. Your research gives you leverage. Who has to go on the attack and who just has to stay and defend gives you leverage. Who needs, like, there's all these different things are leverage. It's not like there was a leverage counter and went up or went down. Like, there is more leverage in the Ukrainian negotiating position from the size of their armed force, from the ability to strike deep inside of Russia now. Like, once the war ends and Ukraine produces all these drones to keep in its storage and all these missiles to keep in its storage, that's something that Russia is going to have to think about in the future. Back in 2022, the deal would have been they could never do that.
I just listened to Mr. Burns.
Thank you for the 100 Danish kroner. My goodness, the Danes continue to finance me as the Greenlander deep state agent. Keeping America at bay. I appreciate the 100 Danish kroner. It means a lot. Thank you. But it's not like there's not a magic leverage meter. The Ukrainians have the ability to strike deep into Russia under the agreement that Hasan. I said Trump, but I meant Hasan. Now that is a Freudian slip. That right there is a Freudian slip. But they have the ability to strike deep into Russia now. You don't take out 40% of a country's export capacity in 3 days, and that does damage. That does real damage to a oil giant like Russia. That's leverage they have now, and that after the war, if they can continue to produce those missiles, they will retain. Same thing is true about their drone capacity, whether it be from FPV to night bombing vampire drones or longer range flamingo missiles. Like, they have an ability to both damage the Russian infantry advancing forward on the battlefield,
bankrupt man,
at a high loss, at a high rate, and they have the ability to throw the war deeper into Russia's interior. That's something they could not do before the war. Before the war, they had drones that had a range of like 150 kilometers. Now they have drones that go to 1,000, 2,000 kilometers. So they have drones. They have more drones that can go further. They can strike into Russia now for the first time. They have a missile program that's ever evolving. They have a much bigger armed forces with much more experience. And they've degraded much of Russia's Soviet reserves, showing that they can not only bring the war back to Russia, but that the war that has continued in Ukraine is going to continue only at a high loss and not on their time schedule. Mind you, Pokrovsk was supposed to be taken at the end of 2024. I remember in winter of that year going around with troops around the Soldovia area, driving around, going near the winter of that year, listening, hey, you know what? The Russians want to take this by the end of this year. Then they have to get to early 2026 to actually capture Pokrovsk. Now they have to face Konstantinivka, Druskivka, Limon, Kramatorsk, Slovyansk. These are locations that are not going to be easy to capture. These are locations that are going to mean immense losses for the Russians. Nobody can tell me that Ukraine's leverage militarily is less than it was back in 2022. Nobody can tell me that Ukraine hasn't demonstrated a will to fight that will make the Russians think about invading again versus 2022. And nobody can tell me that Russia would be more scared of invading a disarmed Ukrainian state versus the Ukrainian state that exists today. Sorry if that doesn't measure out with his leverage counter.
Ukraine has lost leverage over and over again, piece by piece, every single day. And now Ukraine is facing.
I just want to hear what deal exactly they should, because he says, oh, they should have accepted the Minsk Accord, or they should have accepted what was offered in 2022. What terms should they have accepted in 2022? Because if they don't accept disarmament, which Hasan has not said he wants, and I doubt he would say that because even he would know how ridiculous something like that would sound out loud, then what exactly should they have accepted? What should they have offered? The Russians started the war, they wanted the war, they continued the war. And their way for not continuing the war at that point was for Ukraine to disarm itself so they could then continue the war at a later date at a cheaper cost.
Every single day. And now Ukraine is facing, in the current iteration of ceasefire negotiations, Ukraine is facing permanent annexation of Ukrainian territories. Like legal annexation, which is illegal, obviously, but like legal recognition of annexed territories.
That is, what is he talking about? That's not something they're facing. That's something that the Russian government wants. That was something they wanted back then in 2022 now. They were facing disarmament back then. Disarmament of Ukraine threatens the existence of Ukraine as an entity, period. Not one piece of land or another piece of land. I'm not saying that the people of Donetsk don't matter. I'm not saying the people of Luhansk don't matter. But if there's no Ukrainian armed forces, there will be no Ukraine.
That's what the current plan is. Yeah, why aren't you pressing the Ukraine win button? Yeah, just like I'm not pressing the communism button, I'm also refusing to press the Ukraine is going to win button.
A curd is a curd.
Trex 1983 has donated $25. I would donate my firstborn college fund if Anna P. from Kharkiv would open Hamas a third hole. Seriously, he could have at least talked to a...
Look, I don't think Hasan's ever going to talk to Ukrainian. I just don't think that's going to happen. That's been my ask for a very long time. That's my ask of every major creator that has said things about the war that's ignorant, and Hasan is no different. Speak to Ukrainian voices. When Ukrainian voices got too loud, he said it was perverted. He called me war pervert. So like, I'm not going to any direct project to try to get him to talk to them here, because I don't think I could be that ambassador. And I don't think that he wants anything to do with anybody around me. But he doesn't need to do with anything around. There are Ukrainian labor unions, trade unions, or leftists that he could speak to. There are Ukrainians who are displaced or not displaced. There's plenty of people he could speak to. He has simply chosen not to, and is instead continuing to believe that the Boris Johnson peace deal was like the slip and slide that could have gotten us just, whoop, we're out of the war. My gosh, everything's been solved. Everything's great now that Ukraine's disarmed. They're in a, but I gotta think, by the way, he's saying that now they're facing annexation as a whole or legal recognition of annexation. Well, if he's talking about legal recognition of annexation, Ukraine has said again and again and again, under no circumstances will they recognize the annexation of those territories. What they're facing now is the final struggle for the Donbass, right? That's what they're facing now as the Russians try to push into Konstantinivka. As for legal recognition, That is something the Ukrainians don't have to agree to. If the Ukrainians aren't agreeing to withdraw from the Donbass, why would they then agree to recognition? It's the same thing that the Russians have demanded for years now. He says they face it, but they faced it a year ago. They faced it the year before that. They faced it the year before that. And they even faced it towards the latter half of 2022. So, I mean, they're facing the same thing they've always faced. I don't know what the situation has changed greatly on that front. I don't really know.
It's like I'm not pressing the communism button. I'm also refusing to press the Ukraine is going to win button. Yeah, it feels like every single criticism anybody makes of your Russia takes ultimately comes down to you're not giving me as much pro-Ukraine hopium as I want, therefore you must be pro-Russia. Have you ever seen a more reasonable critique? No, I have not.
Because he doesn't look at them.
Also, saying that the Russian economy is crumbling right now when the strikes on Iran has literally given Russia virtually, like, we gave Russia sanctions relief. What are you talking about? The president.
Yeah, can I just throw out there, why is Hasan more angry about people critiquing his Ukraine takes than he is about the American government removing sanctions on the Russians? Why is it that when you talk about Ukraine, it's only in the prism of, God, you know, when I was wrong and the entire internet laughed at me? Well, actually, I was right, and people need to stop being so mean to me. That might be one of the reasons why he hasn't been able to talk to any Ukrainians, because no Ukrainians watch his content anymore. I've met Ukrainian Hasan Piker fans. You know what they tell me? We jumped the fucking ship 4 years ago. That's what they tell me. Maybe that's why.
The oil barrel goes up. And who benefits from that? Russia benefits from that. What the fuck? They don't rely on the Strait of Hormuz.
The Russian economy has been in the pickle. All their economists agree that they're headed towards recession. The National Wealth Fund was likely to be depleted this year. And Vladimir Putin just personally asked oligarchs if they could help finance the war. Literally like, hey, rich guy, can you give me $1 billion? Hey, rich guy, can you give me $1 billion? Right? That is not the actions of a government that is having no problems financing the war. It is true that the bombing of Iran and now the grabbing of the Strait of Hormuz and the removal of sanctions has given them a lifeline. But at the same time, the Ukrainians are targeting their export capacity, and we have no clue how long this war in Iran is going to last. Likely not forever. I'm not saying that the Russian economy is at the brink of collapse. I am saying that the Russian economy has unavoidable issues that will only escalate in intensity and in pain for the Russian public. It is an unavoidable issue that only continues to surmount. I don't know what else to say about Hasan. All I have to say about Hasan is this. His position, in effect, is not that different than Trump. When it comes to policy prescriptions, when it comes to the mineral fund, or when it comes to what the United States, morally believes in, and, yeah, I support Ukraine's XYZ and I support that. But when it comes to doing anything, his position is still, we shouldn't do anything. His position back when he had the Ethan Klein podcast show and he was doing stuff with him, at the time they were friends, he was saying that I don't want to add fuel to the fire. Then Trump won, and it was like, well, we can't just cut them off, but I don't want to surge any aid and just make the situation worse, always assuming that by giving the Ukrainians more means to resist, the Russians would always just respond by pushing harder and not respond by recalibrating their position.
Is an immoral, morally corrupt, bankrupt man.
Thank you so much for the YouTube membership. He always assumed that the pressure given to assist Ukraine would just make the situation worse, not better. Then we got a test of Hasan's policies, not in moral condemnations of Russian action, not in the drum circles for peace that I assume that we think is a better idea, but in not providing Ukraine substantial aid. Aid completely basically collapsed from the United States. All we sold them was the bare bones, less than the bare bones, honestly. And the Ukrainians did what? They expanded their drone capacity. They expanded their missile capacity. They expanded the long-range attacks. They continue to expand their local drone forces to protect their territory. And the war continued. The Russians pushed on, and they've shown no real interest in engaging with Trump's negotiations seriously. Hasan doesn't have a policy prescription for how to end the war. So instead, he has a fairy tale of how the war could have been avoided 4 years ago if Ukraine would have disarmed itself. But let's leave that fact, the disarming part, out of the story. We'll just say it was a deal. A deal to do what? Don't worry about it. A deal to end the war. Whether it would have started the war again in 2 to 3 years, put that aside. It would have ended the war. This is naive, it's ignorant, and at this point he should know better. So I don't know if he'll ever know better. I'm not going to hold out, not going to bet against, just disappointed at the state of Twitch commentary on the war.